Hello, welcome to a talk on the triune brain and how understanding your brain and how it works can help you figure out why you do some of those inexplicable things or why you feel feelings that make no sense. And the triune brain, I think, is a very simple, clear way to understand the brain, which can help you understand yourself. So stay tuned because we are going to launch into that. For those of you watching this on replay and on YouTube, my name is Barbara Heffernan, and I am both a psychotherapist and a life coach. I've specialized in working with anxiety and trauma for 20 years, and I started an online business coaching. My one-to-one psychotherapy practice is separate from Awaken Joy, but the Awaken Joy brand is a coaching brand and is intended to bring you tools and techniques that you can implement, practical things, and that can help you live a more joyful life. So if you're watching on YouTube, please subscribe to my channel and give the video a like. That's a big help. And for those of you watching from my Facebook group, welcome. And as I think you all know, when I'm doing the simultaneous YouTube Facebook thing, I won't be able to see your name when you leave a comment. So you can always just stick your name in your comment and then I'll know it's you, or I'll go back and look at your comments afterwards so we can continue the dialogue. And I really would love this to be a dialogue. So pop in with questions, comments, what makes sense, what doesn't make sense. So, hey, Rob, hey, Jessica. Hi, a couple of other Facebook users. Welcome today. So this is the triune brain. Basically is looking at the brain as having three parts: the reptilian part, the mammalian part, and the human or cognitive part. And this is not official neuroscience, right? I've heard people criticize the triune brain model, which, by the way, I did not invent. The triune brain model is well known, but I've heard people criticize it that it isn't like accurate, but it's accurate enough for it to be extremely useful. And most of us don't have time to really learn an accurate depiction of our very, very complicated organ up here, right? So the triune brain basically says we have a part of our brain that is very similar to reptiles, and that is the oldest part of the human brain. And then on top of that is the mammalian or emotional brain. And then the last part, in terms of evolution of the human being, the last part of the brain to develop was the cognitive part of the brain. So hopefully that all makes sense. And hello, somebody from Orlando and London, and Julia, welcome. Welcome. And as I said, give me questions and I can respond to those so we can make this interactive. So I'm going to ask you a question here. What do reptiles do? Just throw some comments in here about what reptiles do. Think of the reptiles that you have seen in your life, ones you know. Some of you might even have one or two as pets. But what is it that reptiles do? So give me a few comments. Because our reptilian brain, the oldest part of the human brain, basically monitors and executes the same functions that exist in reptiles. And this is the survival part of our brain. Okay, somebody's saying lay in the sun. Yep, reptiles lay in the sun. What else? What else do reptiles do? So it's the survival part of our brain. And it monitors our basic functions and the things that we need to do to survive. So throw out a few more comments. And so reptiles basically eat, reproduce, sleep, lay in the sun, look for food and shelter, survive, right? And so the fight, flight, freeze is very evident in reptiles. And you can picture a lizard kind of laying in the sun, and then the second any kind of person shows up or animal or threat, boom, that reptile's out of there. Or the reptile might, if the reptile is like crawling up a wall and you walk into a room, that reptile might freeze. And the freeze response is a very basic survival response. The freeze response is an animal's way of saying, like, I don't want to be seen here. And so reptiles will freeze, hoping that they won't be noticed, that they'll blend in with their surroundings. But then if the threat becomes larger, they sprint. So you can definitely see the fight, flight, freeze survival response in reptiles. And in the human brain, the part of our brain that controls, or I mean, there's a lot of parts of our brain that get involved with the fight, flight, freeze, but the most well-known piece is the amygdala. So you all have heard about the amygdala. And the amygdala is actually kind of partially in our emotional brain, partially in the old brain stem, the old reptilian brain. But that is the core survival mechanism. And most people, as you're growing up, develop a habitual pattern, a favorite, so to speak. So you could think right now, when you are under threat or feeling stressed, is your response to fight, to flee, or to freeze? Does it depend on the situation, or do you have a very habitual response? And I think for most of us, we can think of somebody in our lives who has trigger quick anger, trigger quick fight response. And then we might know other people who, the second a conflict comes up, boom, they disappear. They totally disappear. So they have a flight response, sorry. And other people might freeze. So the way I see those responses, let's say I'm working with a couple and one person in the relationship is great at arguing and has a fight response and can sort of tap into all the kind of logic that fuels the argument in their favor, and they could just be there like da 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 da, and their partner might be a freezer. And the way that freezing in those situations feels is kind of like wide-eyed, I don't even know how to respond, can't think, can't form a thought. So often a fighter will have a partner who's a freezer, and then that dynamic shows up in a couple dialogue. So let me know, does this make sense to you? And if you can identify like which is your go-to method, fight, flight, or freeze. Freeze first, okay. Yeah, so with these three methods, if you think about a mammal that is trapped or whatever, the first response normally, if an animal is trapped, will be to flee. So that would be sort of option one. If the animal can't flee, the animal will fight, right? That makes sense. And if the animal can't flee and can't fight, the animal will freeze. So I'll come back to a couple of the questions in just a second, but I'm seeing a couple of people say flight, yes, makes sense. Finding it difficult to reflect. Okay. Yes, all three. Okay, so somebody is saying depending on the situation. So if you have an adaptive fight, flight, freeze response, that's great because it should be an adaptive response. Although we can also go back to, I have to remember to come back to this whole issue of survival, because we respond with a survival response in a lot of situations that don't require a survival response. However, having said that, when a survival response is required, if we're flexible, if sometimes we're like, assessing the situation, I'm going to walk away from this, not a good situation, not worth it, adaptive, right? Or sometimes we have to stand up for ourselves and argue with somebody and fight in a reasonable manner, adaptive. Now, freezing tends to happen with the most significant threats. So if you think about a mouse, let's take a mouse and a cat. And the cat is chasing the mouse, and the mouse is running away because it's very fast. So it's fleeing, right? So that's its first response, is to flee. And then let's say the mouse gets caught in a corner and the cat comes closer. Well, the mouse can't fight the cat. The mouse knows it can't fight. So fighting is not an option. So it's going to go to freeze and it will play dead. And you can even picture probably a mouse playing dead. And if a mouse plays dead, cat bites it, picks it up, might play with it a little bit, right? You can picture, in fact, I saw a fox not far from my house playing with a mouse, literally like tossing it in the air and kind of playing with it, which is a little horrifying, but was also very, very interesting. So you have your cat who's holding the mouse and he's playing with it, which if he throws it in the air or he drops it or he puts it down and gets bored, boop, that mouse will be out of there. So the freeze response is adaptive in that situation. The other thing the freeze response does is it floods our body with internal opiates. So if that mouse does end up getting eaten, it will have numbed itself out. It won't be as painful. So we do the same thing. So the freeze response, if it becomes habitual, can actually be one of the ones which can cause the longest term. I don't want to say something that's misleading because, of course, every situation is so different. But the freeze response can sometimes really be an impediment to somebody in terms of moving your life forward. And so with that freeze response, if you understand that it's an anxiety response to a survival threat, and you can begin to calm yourself, that's the best way to deal with that. Opossums definitely freeze. And thank you, Akil. I appreciate that. So let's just come back for a second because I was talking about the reptiles. Okay, so reptiles fight, flight, and freeze. They survive, they eat, they reproduce. And reptiles are not warm and fuzzy, right? Reptiles don't hug one another. If there's a survival threat, a reptile will eat its own eggs. It will eat its own, will eat its own babies. So reptiles don't prioritize relationship. So when we go to reptilian brain, when we feel under threat, we are totally in survival mode and we are not prioritizing relationships. So that's just another thing just to keep in mind here. And hopefully I can come back to that one too. So the mammalian brain. So the mammalian brain, in terms of evolution over time, began to form with a sense of smell, which I find very, very interesting. And if you think about it, I don't think reptiles smell. So the emotional brain, the mammalian brain, began to form with smells. Something smells good, eat it. Smells bad, don't eat it. Smells good, mate with it. Smells bad, run away from it. And this information, right, that's information, smell and result, began to become encoded in the brain and then built the emotional brain. So the emotional brain is basically built around sensory input and response, which could almost be, in a way, emotional response, right? Smells good, eat it, that feels good to our survival. So that's what builds the emotion. That's what originally began to build the mammalian brain. And if you think about mammals, dogs, cats, most of us in the United States anyway have, a lot of households have pets. Around the world, people will have different pets. Mammals like to cuddle. Mammals can be very affectionate, right? Mammals definitely show emotion, right? Like my dog, George, very happy when we come home, very worried George is actually a English sheepdog, so he likes to have everybody in the same room. So when my husband and I are working at home right now and we're in totally different parts of the house, the dog doesn't know where to go. So he gets a little anxious when we're not together. So animals show emotion, right? And our emotional brain is very, very similar to a mammal's brain. And then the third level of the brain, which is the cognitive brain, began to develop as mammals progressed, right? And the cognitive brain has our language centers, has our risk assessment, has an understanding of time. Now, obviously, mammals also have language centers. Dogs talk, right? They understand commands. Even my cat recognizes its name. So mammals definitely have language centers, but I think you're getting a sense of where I'm going with this in terms of how this can be helpful to think about. Because the cognitive layer of our brain is where we turn things into words, where we communicate with other humans, where we look forward towards the future or back into the past. The mammalian brain is very much here and now. So we have these three different parts of the brain, and they don't always talk to one another well. So most of you know that I'm a huge proponent of meditation and mindfulness meditation, because I do feel that mindfulness meditation is an exercise that, or an activity that can be seen as an exercise to get the whole brain working together, because we function best when our entire brain is working together. So give me some comments. Let me know if this is making sense. And I'll also come back to a question or two. So does silence equal freezing? So there's no conflict. So I'd say somebody who avoids conflict is probably a fleer. But I think that depends what the internal experience is like. If you are freezing is almost more of a feeling of like you can't, like your brain kind of goes numb. So people who freeze when they're in arguments will feel like they know they have a point. They know the other person isn't as rational as they think they are, but they can't formulate the words and the sentences, and they can't get it all out, and they feel stuck, and they almost might feel like they can't even leave the conversation. So I hope that helps to understand the freezing piece of it. And someone else is asking, do you consider trying to convince someone with talking to be a form of flight or fight? No. We were talking about the survival response. We started off, so if you rewatch the video, I think it'll make more sense to you. We were talking about the survival, fight, flight, and freeze. So we have these three different parts of the brain, and good, it's making sense. And somebody's saying, thank you, good. That sounds like this might be helpful. So our survival response is so strong that it co-opts the rest of the brain when it's triggered. So when we feel under threat, and that threat feels like a survival level threat, our fight, flight, freeze mode of being, our entire brain is probably, if you were to put an MRI on the brain, it's all lit up in the amygdala and in the parts of the brain that control our survival. And for people who are very logical and very cognitive and speak well and all that sort of thing, that survival response can co-opt the entire frontal lobe. So it's almost like that survival brain takes over the entire brain. And again, I see this often in conflicts, in marital conflicts or conflicts with somebody in your family, because families, we are wired to feel that family is survival, right? Our clan is tied from ancient times to our survival. So when there's a conflict that comes up in our family, we can respond with this fight, flight, freeze survival mechanism, which, as I said, reptiles eat their own babies. So it co-opts our brain, and we are no longer prioritizing the relationship. So it kind of like makes no sense, because what you want more than anything else is peace in the relationship and for the relationship to survive. But you feel so threatened that you might go to any lengths. And so somebody who's a fleer who has a partner who has abandonment issues. If you flee conflict and then that person feels abandoned, the relationship gets worse and worse and worse, right? And so learning not to let the fight, flight, freeze take over. So how do you do that? Here we are. Rob asking, how do you get the tri-brain to work together correctly outside of meditation, living everyday life? Okay, perfect timing. So if you wanted to calm down a pet, what would you do? For those of you who are dog lovers, cat lovers, I'll give you the example. My dog George, and I might have shared this with you before, but my dog George is terrified of thunder and lightning. So when he is like shaking because there's a thunderstorm, and I say to him, George, don't worry about it. The thunder is like a couple minutes away from the lightning. The lightning's nowhere near the house. Is that going to calm George down? So just give me some sense here. If you had George, what would you do to calm him down? What would you do to calm down a mammal? So if I am explaining what's happening to George, he is not going to get it. He's going to hear me going, nah, 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 right? It's not going to comfort him. It's not going to explain anything. He is not going to calm down. So someone's saying, pat it, speak calmly to the dog, love on him, hug him. He's too big to take into my lap, but if you have a lap dog, take it into your lap, right? Get down on the floor. You keep yourself calm, talk to him kindly, and stroke him, right? So, yeah, and so for those of us who are parents, if you remember those early days with the baby, being able to like self-regulate and calm your own voice and breathe deeply, and that's what helps to calm a baby down or calm a pet down. That's what we need. So when you are in a situation where your fight, flight, freeze is going off, telling yourself, I shouldn't be this upset, this doesn't make any sense, like using all this like logic and frontal lobe stuff will do nothing to change how you feel or how you're interacting with your loved ones. Calming yourself down, right? A little bit of self-soothing, diaphragmatic breathing. Doing those things that help you self-regulate and calm down. Because we all function best within, there's a therapy term called the zone of tolerance. And so if your mood is kind of like here, that's where we operate best. When we get too anxious, too angry, too hyper, or too depressed, too low, our whole brain is not working. So we need to self-regulate into the moment. And there is a very famous couples therapist, researcher, whose name always escapes me when I go to refer to him, but it will come back to me, who recommends for couples that your sitting heart rate, your like base heart rate at rest. And if your heart rate goes up during an argument by more than 10 to 15%, you are in fight, flight, freeze mode, and it's time to say, I need a timeout for 5 minutes. I need to go do some diaphragmatic breathing, calm myself down, get myself back into a mode where I can be relational. So someone threw out a question about, is that why abusers primarily abuse their loved ones? Yeah, absolutely. Like you might know somebody who has a fight response that gets them in trouble all the time. They fight at work. They get into fights at bars. They've been arrested for fighting, right? Like, so there are definitely those people who have a way overblown fight response, but they're not necessarily an abuser. And then abusers, like a domestic violence abuser, will use that frontal lobe, right? Domestic violence abusers very often have the ability to have that fight mechanism co-opt the reason, but it still sounds super reasonable, and will be abusive. But yes, because of that primal sense of family, yes, that is, it's very sad that I often feel that humans exhibit their worst behavior with those who they're closest with. And that could be abusers, but it also can be many of us. There's many of us who might talk to our spouse or our kids or something in a way that we would never in 1,000 years talk to a stranger. So that's important to think about. Yes. All right. So the same way, okay, all of you are giving me the right, Dr. Gottman, thank you. Yes, it is Dr. Gottman. Thank you. That's helpful. Okay, another question. Why does alcohol make the reptilian brain? Yeah. Okay. The first thing that alcohol does, even just one glass of alcohol, is it impacts the frontal lobe, the cognitive brain. Now, why? I don't know the chemical reason that's where it goes first, but that's where it goes first. And so it lowers our risk assessment abilities. It lowers our judgment of consequences. It lowers our judgment in general. So it is dampening this part of the brain and bringing this part of the brain into, full blown, which is why so many people after a few drinks might get way more emotional than they would otherwise. This is offline. This goes offline with alcohol pretty quickly, actually. Even those people, who might say like, oh, one drink doesn't affect me. I'm pretty sure it's dampening your frontal lobe. So, but I also don't want to have this talk come across as if the frontal lobe is the best part of the brain, because it's not. We need all three parts of our brain. And the emotional brain and understanding the emotions, so the connection and the conversation between the frontal lobe and the emotional brain is critically important for good decision making. If you don't understand your emotions, if you don't understand what the emotional signals are communicating to you, it will be very hard to make good decisions that feel good and feel right. So you need the whole brain working, and we need our survival response. But we need our survival response maybe 10% of the time that we actually use it, right? Like you need your survival response when, I don't know, a car is barreling down the street and you're on the sidewalk, because our survival response is boom, fast. It's really, really fast. Oh, I know a situation recently that came up, but one of the best ways to describe this would be, you're walking in the woods, you're on a path, you're on a little bit of a hike, and all of a sudden you see something out of the corner of your eye and you jump because you think it's a snake. And then you look again and it's a stick, right? So that's a perfect example of our survival brain. Our survival brain is very, very fast, right? It made you jump just in case that was a snake. You jumped out of the way before your cognitive brain even kicked in. So it's very, very fast, but it's not overly accurate. The cognitive brain is slower, but more accurate. So we need all three parts of our brain, but we definitely don't need the survival brain, even with what's going on right now. Oh, Rob's saying that's why he no longer posts on Facebook during cocktail hour. Thank you for the laugh. I think that's a good plan. Yes. So other questions, comments. I know we've gone to our 30 minutes. I have a handful of other things I'd like to share on this. Memories is one thing I want to talk about, because with high amounts of stress, our memory formation is impacted. So if you think about emotional memories, like you could probably bring up a positive memory that has maybe a sense of smell. Let me know, like, can you think of a memory where like there's a sense of smell that transports you back to a very rich, positive emotion? So that's where that works in a positive way. It also works in a negative way. So when we have incredibly upsetting events in our lives, the memory gets lodged in the emotional brain, where it has all the kind of bells and whistles. It might have sounds, it might have smells, it might have physical reactions, physical feelings, and all of that can get triggered with a reminder. And so that's where the memory has gotten lodged in that emotional brain, because the part of the brain that helps memories move into long-term memory gets shut down with high amounts of stress. So in fawn response, I don't know what that is, so I can't answer your question. The cognitive brain is co-opted, but definitely the cognitive brain gets co-opted a lot for people who have high anxiety. Say this is a very, very, very common. Oh, I know what I was going to say was about COVID before we got the cocktail hour comment. So it's scary, the whole COVID situation. We need to adapt to it. We need to be conscientious and somewhat vigilant, right? Yet it doesn't require a panic response, yet many people are panicking. So the survival part of the brain, remember, doesn't understand time, doesn't understand past or future or risk assessment or any of that. Your reptilian brain is just like in a panic. Whereas what's actually needed in the COVID situation is an understanding of, okay, time, this could last for a while. I need to wear my mask. I need to wear gloves. I need to be careful. I need to stay inside. I can do these things and I will be safe. And some of it is out of my hands, right? Which the reptilian brain never wants to ever accept that something is out of your hands. So that reptilian brain co-ops the reason, and I'm sure there's a couple of people who'll be listening to this who could be arguing with me like, no, we have to be really nervous about this. We have to be really worried all the time, and we have to blah, 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 blah. But actually we don't, right? We need to understand what's happening. We need to take the steps we can to protect ourselves. And then the best thing we can do actually is to lower our stress response so we stay healthier. So hopefully that makes sense. So yeah, so how memories get stored, how the survival brain co-ops the frontal lobe, right? And how the emotional brain can get kind of shunted aside, or the emotional brain can take over. Like with a traumatic memory that gets triggered, the emotional brain can take over. And the cognitive brain, when it gets hijacked, is working in service of the survival brain. So that's what's happening with those people who get really rational and nasty during domestic arguments. Like they're not actually achieving what they want to achieve. It's not actually rational behavior, but they will seem so rational. And they can be so nasty and so destructive to a relationship because they're being driven by this survival response, which is reptilian. So I'm hoping that this is useful for you all. I'd love to, know what you think. Send me some more comments. And the other piece, the question about what do we do about this? I use the example of the dog and the self-soothing, the calming down. I think most of you know I'm a huge proponent of diaphragmatic breathing. Diaphragmatic breathing is one of the only ways to really communicate to that reptilian brain, you're safe enough now. It's okay, right? the reptilian brain, the mammalian brain, like it's safe enough. We're safe enough now. And modulate down. So if you have a pet and you feel anxious, get down on the floor, pet the pet, because we move together. The modulation goes both ways, right? So if you calm yourself to pet a pet, the pet probably is emoting things that help you calm down, a loved one, all of that kind of stuff. And then the other thing is to really practice letting your mammalian brain and cognitive brain focus on the positive things in life, because our brain was developed to help us survive and is completely focused on problems and survival mode problems. And most of us, even with what's happening with COVID right now, we don't need to be focusing 80% of our time on survival-based problems. So allow your mind to take in the beauty of spring, the smell of a rose, the hug, right, of a loved one. Like our loved ones, when we hug them, and like, you know, if you have children, like children can smell so good. I guess sometimes your partners can too. But just like let yourself take in the sensory information that's all around us that's pleasurable. Even something simple like a shower is incredibly pleasurable. And allowing your brain to really focus on that and bring it in helps your entire system regulate. So I hope this is helpful. I'm glad that a couple of people are saying it was helpful, and I look forward to the next time. And I will check all the comments in the YouTube afterwards, as well as in Facebook. And I'll see you guys next week.